لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you back to our class on the essentials of Shafi'i law, Imam al-Hadrami's Safinat Al-Naja, covering ibadat or worship from a Shafi'i primer. This is a level 1 fiqh course, and this lesson focuses on the concept of zakah, the obligatory alms charity. We focus on the conditions and the integrals of zakah at a very rudimentary level, just so as to introduce the concept of zakah in ibadah, but not to get into the details thereof. Our course outcomes remain the same. We want to have an introduction to Islamic law. We want to have this course act as a first step into the legacy of the Shafi'i school, and we would like to learn the 5 pillars of Islam at a beginner level, inshaAllah ta'ala. This lesson, we look, bi'idhnillah, at the 6 types of wealth on which zakah is owed. We look at zakatul fitr or zakah of Eid al-Fitr, and the 8 categories of zakah recipients, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So we begin with the course text as we usually do. قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى فصل أموال التي تلزم فيها الزكاة 6 أنواع. This chapter or section deals with al-amwal, the wealth types, التي which تلزم فيها, it is an obligation with regards to these types of wealth, الزكاة, to dispense of one's zakah, 6 أنواع, and there are 6 types. Now this very straightforward paragraph is actually the only paragraph in the text on zakah. And that is, of course, because this text is intended to be a primer, it is intended to be an introductory work, and the shuruh, Nailul Raja and Kashifatul Saja and other shuruhat, they typically expand on this paragraph to some degree or the other, naturally because there's a lot to expand on. If this is the only paragraph in relation to the concept of zakah, in other fiqh texts you have hundreds of pages on the concept of zakah. So the idea here is to have a primary introduction, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So let us take it one step at a time. The wealth upon which zakah is compulsory are 6 types. You will see there's a footnote beneath each point. So inshallah ta'ala we will look at those footnotes as we proceed. So the first footnote is on the screen at the moment. Zakah is wajib on every Muslim, male, female, adult or child who has possessed a zakah payable amount for 1 lunar year. Now the important points to take note of here is, first and foremost, that zakah is wajib. Now zakah is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, Bunya al-Islamu ala khams, shahadati an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammad Rasulullah wa iqami as-salah wa ita'i az-zakah wa sawmi Ramadan wa hijji al-bayti man istata'a ilay sabila. Or kama qala alayhi salatu wasalam. That Islam is built upon 5. The testimony that there is none worthy of worship besides Allah Azza wa Jal, and that Muhammad Sallallahu is his last and final messenger. Then the establishment of salah, and then the paying of zakah. Zakah is proven not only by the Quran and the Sunnah, but also by ijma'. There's scholarly consensus on the obligatory nature of zakah. As for the Quran, there are more than 80 verses in which Allah Azza wa Jal ties in salah and zakah by stating in various ways, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ, and give, and pray salah or establish the salah and give the zakah. And there are various variations of these words and these commands throughout the Quran. Had Allah Azza wa Jal instructed us once to pay zakah, it would have been obligatory for our lifetime. But He instructs us again and again and again. Following the demise of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sallam, the Khilafah was in the hands of Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala an for 2 years, and he was the first Khalifa of Islam as a result. During those 2 years, Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's hands were tied not only with political matters in general, but also with some religious matters, such as waging war against those who refuse to pay zakah. And there's a long discussion about this and how this came about, but the gist of it is that many Muslims were new to Islam at the time of the Prophet Muhammad's passing. And as a result, they were still becoming accustomed to the religious rituals that Islam establishes. For example, the paying of zakah. The idea of zakah was there and they paid zakah. But the thought was, we're giving our money to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Quran also says this, right? That take from their wealth as a sadaqah and you purify them with it, right? تطهرهم, you purify them with it. So for many Muslims at the time, the leader who took our zakah, who was connected to Allah, is passed away. So do we still need to pay this zakah? We don't have a problem with salah, but why must we pay zakah? So this was some of the thought processes that were happening. And as a result, some Sahaba were inclined to sort of negotiate and say, okay, fine, look, they're still Muslim, they're not paying zakah. Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala an, he says, no, salah and zakah goes hand in hand. If you refuse to pay zakah, if you regard it as not being obligatory, that is a denial of one of the primary facets of Islam, and thus a person who believes in such things will not be considered Muslim. So Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala spent a significant amount of time and resources and energy on recapturing the minds and the hearts of the Muslims and, in a sense, saving Islam from what would have been or what could have been a tremendous loss. Many people reneging from Islam as a result of not understanding their duties in relation to zakah. As far as the conditions and the integrals, there's a few unique aspects about zakah that we need to be familiar with. Where salah is a physical act of worship, zakah is a monetary act of worship. So salah and other similar acts of ibadah are connected to the individual. And therefore, all of the conditions pertaining to salah relate to the individual, right? The person must be, for example, facing the qibla in a state of tahara, their clothing and so forth needs to be sorted out, they need to have their awrah covered. But for zakah, it's less about the individual and more about the wealth because it is a monetary act of worship. So what we can see here in the first footnote is that zakah is wajib upon every Muslim, even if it's a child. As long as they qualify, they meet the conditions to pay zakah. So anyone who has possessed a zakah payable amount. Now this is an important phrase here, zakah payable amount, and I'd like you to take note of this phrase and actually sort of connect it to a word that you jot down. And this word that refers to this concept is called nisab, right? Nisab, the zakah payable amount. Now, the zakah payable amount is based upon certain minimums that the Prophet Muhammad communicated to us within each category of the zakah wealth. So we said that there are 6 types of wealth upon which zakah is obligatory. For each of these 6, right, for each one of these, you are going to find that there are conditions pertaining to them, and there's a nisab for each one. When it comes to livestock, for example, the nisab is a certain amount of animals, right? So livestock is specifically cattle, sheep, and goats, right? Camels, cattle, sheep, and goats. So a certain amount of camels is the nisab amount. And then, you get the next nisab amount is another batch of camels. You have a certain amount over that, then that's a new nisab amount. So there's different nisabs depending on which type of wealth we are talking about. For currency, right, gold, silver, and money, there's a nisab amount. So your money, depending on what type of money it is, will have a nisab amount that's generally fixed to a particular standard. Like you get the gold standard and the silver standard. And the same thing applies to everything else. For crops, there's going to be a nisab and so on and so forth. So in fiqh, we discuss the nisab amounts for every type of wealth. Some forms of wealth is pretty straightforward, like gold and silver, for example. It's a fixed amount of gold, it's a fixed amount of silver. If you have that amount, that's the nisab. If you keep that for a certain period of time, then you need to pay zakah. For others, it's more complex, like livestock. Now, naturally, most of us are not farmers or living in agricultural societies, but there are still those working in the agricultural sector, and they would need to learn and study the laws pertaining to livestock and crops. For most Muslims, however, learning that zakah applies to livestock and zakah applies to crops, that would be necessary, but it would only become fard ain to learn the specifics of livestock and crops if you are personally engaged in that type of vocation or profession or business, etc. For most people, however, we need to learn the zakah on money and the zakah on trading stock, right? Urudut tijara, trading stock. And we need to know the nisab for gold, silver, and whatever other type of money. And you need to know the nisab for trading stock, or how that works exactly. And that would essentially equip you with what you need to know to fulfill your duty as far as zakah is concerned. So we've looked at footnote number 1. Once again, it says that zakah is wajib on every Muslim, male, female, adult, or child who has possessed the zakah payable amount or the nisab for 1 lunar year. Now, this is the second key term that we want to, I want you to take a note of here. 1 lunar year, that concept of 1 lunar year is called a hawl, right? A hawl. So familiarize yourself with the term hawl and, of course, nisab. Right? Hawl and nisab, those are important terms to understand, nomenclature to understand about zakah. Now moving on to the next point, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, in our slides. And the next point reads as follows. We said, أموال التي تلزم فيها الزكاة 6 أنواع, 6 types. النعم, livestock, right? Livestock. So there's a lot of detail here, but we don't get into that much detail at this level, bi'idhnillah. So let's look at the footnote for livestock. Zakah on livestock is limited to, and you should memorize this, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats. You should memorize that so as to not become confused later on when you think about, oh, we bought some chickens and we've got some chickens in the yard and they're laying eggs, maybe we must pay zakah on them. There's no zakah on chickens. Zakah is wajib when one has owned, number 1, a zakah payable number of livestock, or the nisab, for 1 lunar year, the hawl, and this is the third condition about livestock, that they have been grazing on unowned open range pasturage for the entire year. Now, this is a key point in livestock and the zakah on livestock, that if the farmer has to exert any sort of effort and pay money to feed the livestock, which is the standard practice in industrial agriculture across the world, right? When it comes to industrial agriculture or agriculture that is producing for the masses, there are practically no farms that would graze the animals on open pasture, because it would be too much, right? There's like probably thousands upon thousands of animals, and cows, they consume a lot of food, a lot of grass. So to be able to graze, whether that be cows or sheep, on open pasturage for industrial farming is practically impossible. So if that is the case, that the farmer has to pay for the feed of the animals, then that means that they do not pay zakah on those animals, strictly speaking, according to what our madhab says. But if you have animals and they are grazing on open, unowned farmland, so they're grazing for free, you're not paying any money to feed the animals, then you have to pay zakah on those animals. There is no zakah on cattle that were fed fodder or grain only, even if they could have otherwise been grazed. So that was footnote number 2. Now we go back, inshallah ta'ala, to the second type of wealth, 1 naqdan, money. So here the author has chosen to translate an-naqdan as money. Naqd is technically a form of currency, a form of wealth. But originally, there's no there's no currency, there's no paper money in the time of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Originally it is dinars and dirhams, or gold and silver. So we can see in footnote number 3, zakah is wajib for anyone who has possessed the zakah payable amount of gold or silver. What do we call this now again? The zakah payable amount. Right? What is that called? That is called the nisab, right? Of gold or silver for 1 lunar year. Now, the nisab, or the minimum that necessitates zakah for gold, is a quantity known as 20 mithqals. 20 mithqals, this is an important figure for us to learn. 20 mithqals, which amounts to 84.8 grams of gold, right? Now, naturally, the price of gold fluctuates practically all the time on an hourly basis. So one would just go for the price of gold on any particular day. That would equate to 84.8 grams of gold. That is the nisab of gold. On that amount, if one owns the nisab, so there's two things, right? The one is you need to own the nisab, and then number 2 is you need to own it for 1 complete lunar year, right? And just to sort of make it clear, when we say you need to own it, so let's say this is the year begins, I'm just going to choose Ramadan, so R for Ramadan, and then this is Ramadan again the following year. The condition of zakah states that you must have nisab, right? Let's call that nisab. And that nisab must run for the entire year until the next year, right? Until the next year. And if you have that nisab for the entire year, the nisab is the minimum zakatable amount, or more than that, right? Then by the end of this year, when this day comes, you would need to then pay the zakah, which is going to amount to 2.5% of what is owned. So let's say 84.8 grams, or what was it? 84.4 grams of, 84.8 grams of gold, right? That's the nisab. Now, in my currency, in rand, South African rand, 84.8 grams of gold is approximately 100,000 rand, right? That's a nice rounded figure for us to work with. So 100,000 rand. What we're stating here is that you must have that 100,000 rand for 1 full lunar year. You must have it for a haul. So you must have nisab for a haul. If between this day in Ramadan and this day in Ramadan, somewhere along the line in the middle, there was a day in which your nisab dipped beneath the minimal. So it was no longer 100,000 rand. Let's say it dipped to 80,000 rand. That means the day that it dipped down to 80,000 rand of a year, you no longer had nisab. So you did not have nisab for a full lunar year. Even if the very next day you received another 20,000, so it went back up to 100,000 rand. Fact of the matter is, it dipped below the nisab amount, even if it be for one moment during the year. And therefore, this nisab year, this haul, has now been broken. And the day that it went back up to nisab, so technically here, the day that you received the 20,000 rand, it's on this day that you now have a new nisab. So now you have to continue counting, not continue counting rather, but you have to count anew. And then when it reaches 1 year over here, assuming again that it hasn't dipped beneath 100,000 rand, then you should pay zakah of 2.5% on that entire amount. Okay, so that's the essence of how zakah works really on monetary value. But now there's a slight complication within the Shafi'i school that we should explain at this point, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, so that you don't become confused. The Shafi'i madhab is very just in its application of zakah, but in its striving to be just, it can become complex when we try and calculate our zakah, especially within a modern setting. According to the Shafi'i school, the moment you receive a nisab amount of wealth, right? So today, let's just choose the date. The 15th of Sha'ban, 1435, right? I'm not sure what year we're in, 1445. The 15th of Sha'ban, 1445. On that day, you receive say 150,000 rand. It doesn't have to be exactly the nisab amount. It must be at least the nisab amount. So you receive 150,000 rand on the 15th of Sha'ban. Now, when we have that amount of cash, right, 15,000 rand, that is now a nisab. So I need to keep track of that 150,000 rand, and at the end of its lunar year, I would pay 2.5% of that 150,000 rand because I've had it for a year. Tamam? But let's say on the 20th of Sha'ban, also 1445, so it's in that same month, it's just 5 days later, I receive 300,000 rand. Tamam? So on the 15th, I received 150,000 rand. 5 days later, I received 300,000 rand. Technically speaking, in the Shafi'i school, this new amount, because it's also over the nisab, it has its own year. So I have to keep track. Okay, on the 20th of Sha'ban, I received 300,000. Now, next year on the 20th of Sha'ban, assuming that 300,000 did not diminish beneath the nisab amount, then I need to pay 2.5% of that amount when that year expires, right? Now, you can understand the complexity when you are dealing with a business in the modern era, or even a personal venture in the modern era where you have lots of money coming in and out, that it can become complex if there's large chunks of money coming in all the time and it's staying within your possession for a year. That means that you're going to need some sort of an accounting system whereby every time a large amount of money comes in and you know that it's above the nisab, you need to keep track of it so that if a year passes on that money, while it's still in your possession, you pay the nisab, or rather you pay the zakah on that money. The Hanafi school makes it somewhat easier for us in that the Hanafi school looks at the day you start owning the nisab, then the year after you've now owned nisab for 1 year, you calculate 2.5% of all of your wealth that you own, assuming that it's still above nisab. You calculate 2.5% of everything and you pay that in zakah. But you see, the difference here is in the Shafi'i school, if I received 1 million, right, on the, let's say on the 18th of Sha'ban, 1446. Now remember, in my example earlier, I said on the 15th of Sha'ban, I received 150,000. On the 20th of Sha'ban, I received 300,000. So in my possession is 2 nisab amounts that has now reached fruition. It's a year that has passed by. So on the 15th, I need to pay zakah on 150,000. On the 20th, I need to pay zakah on 300,000. But what about earning 1 million on the 18th of Sha'ban? So now on the 20th of Sha'ban, I no longer have a 300,000. I'm sitting with the 300,000 plus the 150,000 plus the 1 million. Do I now pay 2.5% on everything, even though I only got the 1 million 2 days before I'm calculating my zakah? So in the Shafi'i school, that 1 million would not be included. That 1 million that you received on the 18th would have to stay for 1 year above the nisab amount. Then next year on the 18th of Sha'ban, the following year, in other words 1447, then I would pay the zakah for that 1 million, right? So in that way, the Shafi'i madhab makes it somewhat just and fair and equitable for the person who's paying zakah. On the other side of the spectrum, calculating zakah like this for many people is, at least for many people who need to calculate it like this, because I think the majority of people would have one savings account and they don't necessarily keep track of monies coming in and monies going out. But if you are in such a situation, now you can understand the dynamic. The Shafi'i school would see that there's different amounts at different times, and each amount that is over nisab gets its own year. Whereas the Hanafi method of calculation allows you to calculate it once off. However, it's even going to apply on wealth that you got the other day, which you obviously didn't have for the year. But for people who have those amounts of wealth, it is important to take into consideration the fact that you're only paying 2.5%. That's a minimal, you can pay more. And to pay 2.5% on one's wealth, even though you may not have had it for a complete year, you've had some of it for the year, that might be the easier way or the more convenient way for most people if they choose not to calculate it according to the more complex system that we've discussed. But it's important that we understand those differences as well. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Let's look at the footnote to complete it. So if you have 84.8 grams of gold, on which 2.5% is due, and for silver it's 200 dirhams, which is equal to 594 grams of silver, on which 2.5% is due. Now the issue comes into money, right? Because you have the nisab of gold and you have the nisab of silver. But when it comes to fiat currency or paper money, how do we then calculate it? Do we calculate it according to the gold standard or according to the silver standard? Most of the books that I've come across, they tend to say what this translation is saying as well, which is that while there is a considerable difference between the value of gold and silver, zakah minimum, the minimum for monetary currency should correspond to that of silver, since it is more beneficial for the poor. Most scholars tend to say this. Sheikh Nuh Hamim Kala says this, if I recall correctly. Several other scholars have said this as well. However, I've seen now in the recent years, my own teacher, rahimahullah ta'ala, who passed away, Mufti Taha Karaan, I've seen others as well, ruling that zakah in the Shafi'i school should be calculated according to the gold standard and not according to the silver standard. Let me explain why. So, as the author states here, there's a considerable difference. Now, in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, there wasn't as big a difference, right? The silver standard and the gold standard, see 594 grams compared to 84.8 grams, that was, in terms of value, it was more or less similar. And according to the rates today, there's a vast difference, right? Now, the statement that calculating one zakah according to the silver standard is more beneficial to the poor is a subjective statement. We have to analyze that. The idea here is, look, the zakah or rather the nisab amount for silver being 200 dirhams or 594 grams. If I use the rand currency, this amounts to approximately 10,000 rand. Now, if you compare 100,000 rand to 10,000 rand, that's a huge difference, right? That's a huge difference. The second point is that it's more beneficial to the poor, the absolutely destitute, and those living beneath the breadline, because many more people will be paying zakah if we were to calculate it according to the silver standard. If you calculate your nisab according to the gold standard, far less people are going to be paying zakah, right? And the idea there is that there's then more for the poor. However, 10,000 rand within a contemporary context is not considered affluence, right? If somebody has a 10,000 rand in their savings and they keep it for a year, you wouldn't consider such a person affluent within a contemporary setting. You would consider that person maybe middle class, but just entry middle class. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. It's not a big amount. And that means that you're going to end up having many people who are actually not affluent, right? They barely meet the silver nisab criteria, but they meet it. Now you're going to have them paying zakah when technically, according to standards of living in contemporaneous times, they are actually considered poor from a certain perspective, right? They're not necessarily destitute, but that's not affluence. And the philosophy behind zakah in Islam is that it's redistribution of wealth. So it's taking the wealth from those who have a surplus and they have extra and they have no need for it, and you take a small percentage of their wealth and you redistribute it to those who absolutely need it. But now if you go into the middle and you take from the underprivileged middle class or the lower middle class and you then distribute that to to the, the absolutely destitute, you're actually creating a bit of poverty within the middle class as well. And for this reason, many scholars are actually of the opinion that we should calculate our zakah, at least according to the Shafi school, we should calculate our zakah according to the gold standard. Now you may say, but wouldn't this be problematic for the poor, because now less and less people are going to be paying zakah? And the answer is, in my humble opinion, that no, it wouldn't put the poor at the back foot, because they are in fact going to still be getting the significant amounts of zakah from those who are affluent, because 2.5% of their wealth, right, of the affluent segment of society, is far greater than the small percentages that you're going to get from people who barely make the zakah, the nisab minimum based on silver. Right? If you look at a person who has, say, 15,000 or 20,000 rands in their account for one full lunar year, 2.5% of 10,000, 20,000 rand isn't much. But for people who are sitting with 2 million, 3 million within their accounts, and they base their nisab amount according to gold, they are still going to give far more zakah, and the poor are going to be far more privileged in that sense. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So we've clarified the issue. Is there a discussion on whether zakah applies to paper money or not? Yes, there's a theoretical and academic discussion on that. It's an older discussion because paper money's been around for a while. I'd just like to mention the concluding remarks in that discussion and the rebuttal against those who say that there's no zakah on paper money. The essence of it is, if you don't apply zakah to paper money, then in essence you don't apply zakah at all, because nowhere in the world, as far as I know, is there a widespread use of gold and silver. Nowhere in the world. And paper money in general, while once upon a time it was based on the gold standard, in this day and age, no one bases their paper money on the gold standard any longer. So it has come to replace gold and silver as currency. Whether that's right or wrong or good or bad, that's another topic for another time. The point here is, there's no doubt that zakah applies to fiat currency or paper money. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. We proceed inshallah ta'ala. Then the next part is about crops. And we won't get into too much detail on crops because again, we don't live in an agricultural society. But footnote number 4 states, the zakah for crops is only on the staple types that people cultivate, dry and store. It's not all crops, and it's not everything that would be called crops, such as wheat, barley, millet, rice, etc. There's no zakah on fruit except for raw dates and grapes, and there's no zakah on vegetables, nor is there zakah on seasoning such as cumin or coriander, since the aim in using them is preparation of food, not nourishment. The minimal quantity on which zakah is payable for crops is 618.8 kilograms of net dried weight, free of husks or chaff. The zakah for crops that have been watered without effort, meaning it's watered by the rain, as by rain and the like, is 10% of the crop. The zakah for crops that have been watered with effort, so you've got irrigation systems and you're paying for the water, then such as on land irrigated by ditches, is 5% of the crop. One is obligated to pay zakah as soon as one possesses the zakah payable amount of grain, or when the ripeness and wholeness of a zakah payable amount of dates or grapes is apparent. Otherwise, one is not obligated. Now, this nicely summarizes zakah on crops. We don't really need to add anything at this level as a practical step, because we generally are not going to be paying zakah on crops, and we probably don't know anybody who's going to be paying zakah on crops. I may be wrong, but then, of course, that would still be a rare case. Later on, perhaps at the second level or even later on in the more advanced course like Reliance of the Traveller, there we learn the length and breadth of details pertaining to zakah on all types of levels. So whether it be on crops or whether it be on cattle, etc., we learn all the details there. Now we proceed into the next and probably the second most important topic under zakah, which is wealth acquired from business, in which 2.5% of the value of the commodity should be discharged. So this leads us to footnote number 5, and that's this one. Zakah on trading goods, right? Zakah on trading goods is wajib, it's compulsory for anyone who has possessed trading goods for a year. So if you have trading stock for a year, that's the first condition. Number 2, at the end of that year, the value of your trading stock equals or exceeds the zakah minimum of gold or silver. That actually reminds me about something. Remember I said, in the past I've seen most scholars leaning towards calculating one's zakah based on the silver nisab, and more recently more and more scholars are saying that the zakah should be calculated according to the gold nisab. Still, if people choose to calculate the zakah based on the silver nisab, they are permitted to do so. There's ikhtilaf on the matter, and that's an option that people still have, and many people actually still prefer that, simply because if they don't calculate their zakah according to the silver nisab, then they'll never pay zakah, because for many people the gold nisab is out of their reach. At least it's out of their reach in the sense of they might have the nisab, but chances of them keeping it for an entire year is low. Of course, some people have savings and the like, so Allah knows best. So back to trading stock, this is a very important concept. Notice the difference here. The first difference is that if you have trading stock, you don't say, okay, I started from when I had the nisab. No, there's no nisab to start off with. Do you have trading stock, and do you have it for 1 year? Number 2, at the end of that 1 year, does it equal to or exceed the zakah minimum of gold or silver? So again, the standard rule is it should be calculated according to gold, but if somebody chooses to calculate it according to silver, they may. And then the third condition, that the trade goods have been acquired through a transaction or received as a gift given in return for something else, or such as an article rented from someone in order to rent them out to others at a profit, or land rented from someone in order to rent it out to others at a profit. And so what is this condition stating? It is essentially stating that you should have received those trading goods by way of a transaction, right? Either a bartering transaction or a monetary transaction. But if you received it as inheritance, or you received it as a pure gift, right, with no money changing hands, there's no goods changing hands, it's just you receiving it and there's no price for it, then you wouldn't pay zakah on that. And then number 4, that at the time of acquisition, the time that you receive those trading goods, the owner intended to use the goods for trade. Right? When you received it with the intention of trading with it. So those are the conditions on zakah of trading stock. So regardless of what you may be trading in, right, if it's products or commodities that you are buying and then selling, that would be trading stock. Trading stock does not apply to your assets, doesn't apply to the tools that you use, it doesn't apply to a service that you offer. It is specifically about the products, the trading goods, in other words, and Allah knows best. So that was footnote number 5. We go to the next point. Treasure troves. What are treasure troves? Number 6, and then mines as well. We'll cover both. Al-Rikaz is treasure troves, and wal-Ma'din is mines. So we look at footnote number 6 and 7 and cover both of that bi'idhnillah ta'ala. Firstly, number 6, an immediate zakah of 20% is due when one finds a treasure trove. Now there's some strict conditions that make this practically impossible to apply today. So, number 1, that was buried in pre-Islamic times or by non-Muslims. It was buried either in pre-Islamic times or it was buried by non-Muslims, whether ancient or modern. If it amounts to the zakah minimum and the land is not owned, right, then you would have to pay 20% on zakah for that. If such a treasure is found on owned land that belongs to somebody, it belongs to the owner of the land. if found in a masjid or street, or if it was buried in Islamic times, it is considered as a lost and found article, or luqta, which is dealt with in mu'amalat. Number 7, this is about mines, right? In South Africa, we have gold mines, we have diamond mines, we have all sorts of mines here. So a zakah of 2.5% is immediately due on, number 1, the zakah minimum or more of gold or silver, excluding anything else such as iron, lead, crystal, emerald, or other, even diamonds, on which there is no zakah, right? There's no zakah on diamonds and the like. And number 2, extracted from a mine located on land permissible for the miner to work or owned by him. And number 3, that this amount of ore has been gathered by working at the site one time or several times uninterrupted by abandoning or neglecting the project. The zakah is only paid after the ore is refined into metal. Okay, so treasure troves and mines is obviously going to be even more rare and more restricted in its application than crops and livestock. But still, if you happen to be in that business, or you happen to be in this type of industry, these are important points to be wary of. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Now we proceed to a special type of zakah, which is called the zakah of Eid al-Fitr, or we call it fitrah. I'm not sure if they call that fitrah everywhere in the world, but in South Africa customarily we call fitrah, right? The zakat al-fitr, we call it fitrah. The zakah of Eid al-Fitr is wajib for every free Muslim, male, female, or child. Remember, we said zakah is connected to the wealth and not to the person. Provided that one has the necessary amount of food, which amounts to about 2 kilograms of wheat, or 2.036 to be precise, or in money value thereof. Now this part here, or in money value thereof, is actually not the Shafi'i school's position, right? This is against the Shafi'i school. The Shafi'i school strictly wants the commodity, so you need to pay in staple food. But because of the impractical nature of fulfilling that as is, most Shafi'is adopt another school of thought and their approach when it comes to paying, specifically the Hanafi school in relation to paying for one's zakat al-fitr in monetary form. So one must have the minimal amount, right, for the day of Eid for oneself and for those who one is obliged to support. So if I have the necessary amount of food, let's call it 2 liters or 2 kilograms. 2 kilograms for me, 2 kilograms for my wife, 2 kilograms for my daughter, 2 kilograms for my mother. Let's say those are the people who I am obliged to support. If I have support for all of them for the day and night of Eid, and I have what one needs to clothe them, all of us that I mentioned, and I'm in excess of my debts and housing expenses, if I have that and still have more, that means I must pay zakat al-fitr. The zakah of Eid al-Fitr becomes wajib when the sun sets on the night before the Eid. Okay. The zakah of Eid al-Fitr consists of 2.036 kilograms of the main staple of the area in which it is given. Of the kinds of crops on which zakah is payable. So it needs to come from either rice or wheat or something of the sort. If the main staple is bread, only wheat may be given. Tamam. It is permissible to give the zakah of Eid al-Fitr to deserving recipients anytime during Ramadan, though the best time is on the day of Eid al-Fitr before the Salah. It is not permissible to delay giving it until after the day of Eid. That is, one may give it until sunset on the day of Eid, right? And others have considered it to be expired by the time the processions of Eid begin. But for the Shafi'i school, when the sun sets, that's the expiry time. And it is a sin to delay until after this, and then one must still make it up even though you sinned and you missed the cut-off date. So that's the essence of the zakah of Eid al-Fitr. And of course there's a lot more to discuss about it, but this suffices. It's not even included in the book really. It's an extra note that's been added in both in the sharh as well as in the translation here. We proceed inshallah ta'ala to the next segment. This is actually the last discussion in the kitab rather in the chapter here, and that is on the 8 categories of zakah recipients. Now this is all derived from a verse in the Quran, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ ila akhir al-ayah. Sadaqat or charity is only for, right? Innama. And that word innama is for hasr, to limit. So the understanding when it comes to zakah is that zakah is limited to these 8 categories, very strict in terms of its ruling. Zakah may only be given to Muslims, it may only be from these 8 categories, and it may not be given anywhere or to anyone else. Sadaqah, on the other hand, is far more flexible. So let's see who are the 8 categories. The first is the faqir, or the destitute. This is someone who does not have wealth or earning that is sufficient for himself, meaning for his dependents. Number 2, the miskin. Similar to the faqir, however, he has some money. So let's say the person has a job, they do work, right? They have an income, but it is not sufficient to cover the expenses. They have a shortfall, a significant shortfall, and they may still receive zakah. Then number 3 is the amil, the zakah collector. Of course, there's conditions for each of this. The zakah collector is dispatched by the amir, by the sultan, by the khalifa to collect zakah, and then their wage or their salary may be taken from the collection of zakah with strict conditions. Number 4, mu'allafatul qulub, those whose hearts need to be reconciled. Either they recently embraced Islam or there's some specific situation there in which they would be aided with some support of zakah, to the point that if you support them and their hearts warm up to Islam, then others who they may be influential over may also embrace Islam. Again, there's a lot of discussion on who exactly qualifies here. Then you have riqab, those slaves who are purchasing their freedom, right? A mukatab slave is a slave who's entered into a agreement with their owner to purchase their own freedom, and then they pay it off. And then, of course, those in debt, anybody in a state of debt may receive zakah to pay off the debt. And then, fi sabilillah, those fighting in the path of Allah. Now, that's the literal translation of fi sabilillah. Contemporaneously, fi sabilillah has come to be referring to many other concepts. But originally, it is those fighting for Allah, people engaged in Islamic military operations for whom no salary has been allotted in the army roster. Now, there's a debate, or not a debate, I should say. There is some ikhtilaf around this issue as to whether zakah can also be extended to other forms, right? Not physical combat jihad, but other forms of the proselytization and the spread and the da'wah of Islam. The majority of scholars opine that it is not allowed to be distributed elsewhere except in fi sabilillah, literally, whereas the minority view is that it may be used in other avenues. I've seen many who don't even regard that as a valid view, but it's a view that exists nonetheless. So that view technically would extend zakah to madaris, masajid, and many other types of da'wah, even da'wah in the form of calling non-Muslims to Islam, or reinvigorating the Islam of those whose Islam needs reinvigoration. And then finally, Ibn Sabil, right, the traveler in need of money. Now there's details to all of this, but this introduces the concept to us. It makes it such that we can actually memorize this, so that when we get into the more detailed text, we have something to work off of, right? We've got a basis, we've got the basic rules and the integrals and the conditions, then we build up upon that bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So there is even some rules about who we can and cannot pay zakah to and the like. For example, we discussed here that zakah is wajib on every Muslim male, female, adult or child, but to whom should you be paying your zakah, right? To whom should you be paying your zakah? If you have, for example, a mother or a father or an uncle, etc., who are poor and destitute, can you give the zakah to them, right? Now, for the uncle and the aunt and the cousin and so forth, yes, you can absolutely give your zakah to them because you are not necessarily going to be obliged to support them. But those individuals whom you are obliged to support, anybody who the Sharia obliges you to support, nafaqah is compulsory for you upon them. You cannot give zakat to them, right? You cannot give zakat to them. It must be given as a financial duty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed. For example, if I give zakah to my wife, I'm already compelled by the Sharia to pay nafaqah and to support my wife. The same thing applies with regards to my mother. So if there's somebody that we have to support according to the rules of the Sharia, then we cannot resort to giving them zakah. So to conclude that, I've asked a question about this as well, just to sort of knock the nail in, and that is, can a son give his zakah to his underprivileged father? Now, there are other questions on this topic that you can find in our quiz that has been prepared for you. But now we summarize the lesson, inshaAllah ta'ala. We looked in this lesson at the 6 types of wealth on which zakah is owed. We looked at the zakah of Eid al-Fitr, and we've looked at the 8 categories of zakah recipients. That brings us to the end of this lesson. I hope and pray that this was of benefit and that you could understand the concept at least at this primary level. But next we'll tackle Sawm, fasting, inshaAllah ta'ala. Until then, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad, subhanallahi wa bihamdi, subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik, nashadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
لا إله إلا الله محمد